Chapter 15. As Stuart departed from one door, Florence knocked upon the other, and Madeline, far shaken out of her usual serenity, admitted the cool Western girl with more than gladness. Just to have her near helped Madeline to get back to her balance. She was conscious of Florence's sharp scrutiny, then of a sweet, deliberate change of manner. Florence might have been burning with curiosity to know more about the bandits hidden in her house, the plans of the cowboys, the reasons for Madeline's suppressed emotions, but instead of asking Madeline questions, she introduced the important subject of what to take on the camping trip. For an hour they discussed the need of this and that article, selecting those things most needful, and then packing them in Madeline's duffel bag. That done, they decided to lay down fully dressed as they were in riding costume and sleep, or at least rest, the little remaining time left before the call to saddle. Madeline turned out the light, and, peeping through her window, saw dark forms standing sentinel-like in the gloom. This fidelity to her swelled her heart, while the need of it presaged that fearful of something which, since Stuart's passionate appeal to her, haunted her inevitability. Madeline did not expect to sleep, yet she did sleep, and it seemed to have only been a few moments until Florence called her. She followed Florence outside. It was a dark hour before dawn. She could discern saddled horses being held by cowboys. There was an air of hurry and mystery until about the departure. Helen, who came tiptoeing down with Madeline's other guests, whispered that it was like an escape, and she was delighted. The others were amused, and to Madeline it indeed was an escape. In the darkness, Madeline could not see how many escorts her party was to have. She heard low voices, the champing of bits and the thumping of hooves, and she recognized Stuart when he led up Majesty for her to mount. Then came a pattern of soft feet and the whine of dogs. Cold noses touched her hand, and she saw the long, grey, shaggy shapes of her pack of Russian wolfhound. That Stuart meant to let them go with her was indication how he felt and studied her pleasure. She loved to be out with the hounds and her horse. Stuart led Majesty into the darkness, past the line of mounted horses. "I guess we're ready," he said. "I'll make the count." He went down the line, and on the return, Madeline heard him say several times, "Now everybody, ride close to the horse in front, and keep quiet till daylight." Then the snorting and pounding of the big black horse in front of her told Madeline that Stuart had mounted. "All right, we're off," he called. Madeline lifted Majesty's bridle and let the roan go. There was a crack and a crunch of gravel, fire struck from stone, a low whinny, a snort, and then slow, short clip-clop of iron hooves on hard ground. Madeline could just discern Stuart and his black outline in the shadowy grey before her. Yet they were almost within touching distance. Once or twice one of the huge, staggy hounds leapt up at her and whined joyously. A thick belt of darkness lay low, and seemed to thin out above it to a grey fog through which a few stars shone through. It was altogether an unusual departure from the ranch, and Madeline, always susceptible even to ordinary incidents that promised well, now found herself thrillingly sensitive to the soft beat of hoofs, the feel of cool, moist air, the dim sight of Stuart's dark figure. The caution, the early start before dawn, the enforced silence, these lent the occasion all that was needed to make it stirring. Madeline plunged along into a gully, where sand and rough going made Madeline stop romancing to attend to riding. In the darkness, Stuart was not so easy to keep close to, even on the smooth trails, and now she had to be watchfully attentive to doing it. And then followed a long march through drag sand. Meanwhile, the blackness gradually changed to grey. At length, Majesty climbed out of the wash, and once more his iron shoes rang on stone. He began to climb. The figure of Stuart and his horse loomed more distinctly in Madeline's sight. Bending over, she tried to see the trail, but could not. She wondered how Stuart could follow a trail in the dark. His eyes must be piercing as they somehow looked. Over her shoulder, Madeline could not see the horse behind her, but she heard them. As Madeline climbed steadily with majesty, they saw the dark gray growing opaque and change, lighten, then lose its substance and yield the shapes of the yucca and the octolo. Dawn was about to break. Madeline imagined she was facing east. Still, she saw no brightening of sky. All at once, to her surprise, Stuart and his powerful horse stood clear in her sight. She saw the characteristic rock and cactus and bush that covered the foothills. The trail was old and seldom used, and it was zigzagging and turning and twisting. Looking back, she saw the short, squat figure of Monty Price humped over his saddle. Monty's face was hidden under his sombrero. Behind him rode Dorothy Combs, and the next loomed up the lofty form of Nick Steele. Madeline and the members of her party were riding between cowboy escorts. Bright daylight came, and Madeline saw the trail was leading up towards the foothills. It led in a roundabout way through the short gullies full of stone and brush washed down by floods. At every turn now Madeline expected to come upon water and the waiting pack train. But time passed, and miles of climbing and no water or horses were met. Expectations in Madeline gave place to desire. She was hungry. Presently, Stuart's horse went splashing into a shallow pool. Beyond that, damp places in the sand showed here and there, and again more water in rocky pockets. Stuart kept on. It was 8 o'clock by Madeline's watch when, upon turning into a wide hollow, she saw horses grazing on spare grass, a great pile of canvas-covered bundles, and a fire round which the cowboys and 2 Mexican women were busy. Madeline sat her horse and reviewed her followers as they rode up single file. Her guests were in a merry mood, and they all talked at once. "Get some breakfast, and be quick about it," called Stuart without ceremony. "No need to tell me to hustle," said Helen. "I'm simply ravenous. This air makes me hungry." For that matter, Madeline observed Helen did not show any mark of contrast to the other. The hurried order, however, did not interfere with the meal being somewhat in the nature of a picnic. While they ate and talked and laughed, the cowboys were packing horses and burros and throwing the diamond hitch, a procedure so interesting to Castleton that he got up with a coffee cup in hand and tramped from one place to another. "Heard of that diamond hitch," he observed to a cowboy. "Bally good job." As soon as the pack train was in readiness, Stuart started it off in the lead to break trail. A heavy growth of shrub, interspersed with rock and cactus, covered with slopes, and now all the trail appeared to be uphill. It was not a question of comfort for Madeline and her party, for comfort was impossible. It was a matter of making the best of the travel possible. Florence rode corduroy breeches and high-topped boots, and the advantage of this muscular garb was at once in evidence. The riding habits of the other ladies suffered considerably from the sharp spikes. It took Madeline's watchfulness to save her horse's legs, to pick the best pieces of open ground, to make cutting off from the trail, and to protect herself from the outreaching thorny branches, so that the time sped by her without knowing it. The pack train forged ahead, and the trailing couples grew further apart. At noon, they got out of the foothills to face the real ascent of the mountains. The sun beat down hot, and there was little breeze, and the dust rose thick and heavy in the pall. The view was restricted, and what serenity lay open to the eye was dreary and drab, a barren monotony of slow-mounting slopes ridged by rocky canyons. Once Stuart waited for Madeline, and as she came up to him, he said, "We're going to be having us a storm." Well, that'll be a relief. It's so hot and dusty, replied Madeline. Shall I call a halt and make camp? Here? Oh, no. What do you think is best? Well, if we have us a good healthy thunderstorm, it'll be something new for your friends. I think we'd be wise to keep on going. There's no good place around here to make camp. The wind would blow us right off the slope if the rain doesn't wash us off. It'll take all day travel, though, to reach a good camping spot, and I can't promise it. We're making pretty slow time. If it rains, let it rain. The pack outfit's well covered. We'll just have to get wet. Surely, replied Madeline, and she smiled at his inference. She knew what a storm was in this country, and her guests had yet to experience one. If it rains, let it rain. Stuart rode on, and Madeline followed. Up the slope toiled and nodded the pack animals, the little burros going easily where the horses labored. Their packs, like the humps of camels, bobbed from side to side. Stones rattled down, the heat waves wavered black, and the dust puffed up and sailed. The sky was pale blue like heated steel, except where dark clouds peered over the mountain crest. A heavy, sultry atmosphere made breathing difficult. Down the slope, the trailing party stretched out in twos and threes, and it was easy to distinguish the weary riders. Half a mile further up, Madeline could see over the foothills to the north and west and a little south, and she forgot the heat and weariness and discomfort of her guests in the wide, unlimited perspective of sun-scorched earth. She marked the gray valley and the black mountains and the wide red gateway of the desert, and the dim, shadowy peaks, blue in the sky they pierced. She was sorry when the bleak, gnarled cedar trees were shut off from her view. Then came a respite of the steep climb. The way led into the winding course through a matted, storm-wrenched forest of stunted trees. Even up at this elevation, the desert reached out its gaunting hand. The clouds overspread the sky, hiding the sun, made a welcome change. The pack train rested, and Stuart and Madeline waited for the party to come up. Here he briefly explained to her that Don Carlos and his bandits had left the ranch some time in the night. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and a faint wind rustled the scant foliage in the cedars. The air grew oppressive, and the horses panted. Sure's gonna be a hummer, said Stuart. The first storm always is bad. I can feel it in the air. The air, indeed, seemed to be charged with a heavy force that wanted to be liberated. One by one, the couples dismounted in the cedar forest, and the feminine contingent disclaimed equity for rest. But there was to be no permanent rest until night, and then that depended upon reaching the crags. The pack train wagged onward, and Stuart fell in behind. The storm center gathered slowly around the peaks. A low rumble and a bowl of thunder increased in frequency, and slowly the light shaded as smoky clouds rolled up. The air grew, and the exasperating breeze puffed a few times and then failed. An hour later, the party had climbed high and was rounding the side of a great bare ridge that long had hidden the crags. The last burro of the pack train plodded over the ridge, out of Madeline's sight. She looked backwards down the slope and mused to see her guests change wearily from side to side in their saddles. Far below lay the cedar flats and the foothills, and far to the west the sky was still clear, with shafts of sunlight shooting down from behind the encroaching clouds. Stuart reached the summit of the ridge, and though only a few rods ahead, he waved to her, sweeping his hand round to what he saw beyond. It was an impressive gesture, and Madeline, never having climbed as high as this, anticipated much. Majesty surmounted the last few steps and snorted and halted beside Stuart's black. To Madeline, the scene was as if the world was changed. The ridge was a mountain top. It dropped off before her into a black, stone-ridged, scrub-patched, many-canyon gulf. Eastward, beyond the gulf, round, bare mountain heads loomed up. Upwards to the right lay giant shapes of cliffs and benches and withered slopes of fir-bound and pine-fringed crags standing dark and bare against the stormy sky. Masked, inked clouds were piling up against the peaks, obscuring the highest ones. A fork of white lightning flashed, and like the boom of an avalanche, thunder followed. The bold world of broken rock under the slow mustering of storm clouds was a grim, awe-inspiring spectacle. It was the beauty of the sublime and the majestic type. The fierce desert had reached up to the most magnetic heights where heat and wind and frost and lightning and flood contended in an everlasting strife. And before their onslaught, this mighty upflung world of rugged stone was crumbling, splitting, and wearing with rain. Madeline glanced at Stuart. He had forgotten her presence. Immovable as stone, he sat his horse, dark-faced, dark-eyed, and like an Indian, unconscious of thought, he watched and watched. To see him thus, to divine the strange affinity between the soul of this man become primitive, and the savage environment that had developed him were powerful helps to Madeline Hammond in her strange desire to understand his nature. A cracking of iron-shod hoofs behind her broke the spell. Monty had reached the summit.
"Jane, what it wouldn't be doing in a minute Moses himself couldn't tell," observed Monty.
Then Dorothy climbed to his side and looked.
"Oh, isn't that perfectly lovely?" she exclaimed. "But I wish it wouldn't storm. We'll all get wet."
Once more Stuart faced the ascent, keeping to the slow heave of the ridge as it rose southwards toward the looming spires of rock. Soon he was off smooth ground, and Madeline, some rods behind, looked back with concern at her friends. Here the real toil, the real climb began, and a mountain storm was about to burst in all of its fury. The slope that Stuart entered upon was a magnificent monument in the ruined crags above. It was a southerly slope, and thereof semi-arid, covered with cypress and yakima and some shrubs that Madeline believed was manzetta. Every foot of the trail seemed to slide under majesty. What hard ground there was could not be traveled upon, owing to the spiky coverings or masses of shattered rock. Gullies lined the slope. Then the sky grew blacker. The slow gathering clouds appeared to be suddenly arid. They piled and rolled and mushroomed and obscured the crags. The air moved heavily and seemed to be laden with sulphur smoke, and sharp lightning flashes began to play. A distant roar of wind could be heard through the peals of thunder. Stuart waited for Madeline under the lee of the shelving cliff where the cowboys had halted the pack train. Majesty was sensitive to the flashes of lightning. Madeline patted his neck and softly called to him. The weary burros nodded. The Mexican women covered their heads with their mantles. Stuart untied the slicker at the back of Madeline's saddle and helped her into it, and then he put on his own. The other cowboys followed suit. Presently, Madeline saw Monty and Dorothy rounding the cliff and hoped the others would come soon. A blue-white, knotted rope of lightning burned down out of the clouds, and instantly a thunderclap crashed and seemed to shake the foundations of the earth. And then it rolled, as if banging from cloud to cloud, booming along the peaks, reverberating from low and deep, at last to rumble away into silence. Madeline felt the electricity in Majesty's mane, and it seemed to tingle through her nerves. The air had a weird, bright cast. The ponderous clouds swallowed more and more of the eastern domes. This moment of the breaking of the storm, with a strange growing roar of wind like a moaning monster, was pregnant with a heart-disturbing emotion for Madeline Hammond. Glorious it was to be free and healthy, out in the open under the shadow of the mountain and cloud, in the teeth of the wind and rain and storm. Another dazzling blue blaze showed the bold mountainside and the storm-driven clouds. In the flare of the light, Madeline saw Stuart's face.
"Are you afraid?"
she asked. "Yes," he replied simply. Then the thunderbolt racked the heavens, and as if it boomed away in lessening power, Madeline reflected with surprise upon Stuart's answer. Something in his face had made her ask him what she considered was a foolish question. His reply amazed her. She loved a storm. Why should he fear it, he whom she did not even associate with fear?
"How strange. Have you been out in many storms?"
A smile that was only a glimmer flinted across his dark face. "In hundreds of them. By day, with the cattle stampeding. At night, alone on the mountains with the pines crashing and the rocks rolling. In flood, on the desert."
"It's not only the lightning, then?" she asked.
"No, all the storm." Madeline felt that henceforth she would have less faith in what she imagined was her love of the elements. What little she knew. If this iron-nerved man feared a storm, then there was something about a storm to fear. And suddenly, as the ground quaked upon her horse's feet, and all the sky grew gray and crisscrossed by flaming streaks, and between thunderous reports there was a strange hollow roar sweeping down upon her, she realized how small she was with her knowledge and experience of the mighty force of nature. Then, with perplexity of character of which she was wholly conscious, she was humble and submissive and reverent and fearful, even while she gloried in the grandeur of the dark, clouded shadow crags and canyons, the stupefied strife of sound, the wonderful driving lances of white fire. With blacker gloom and deafening roar came the torrent of the rain. It was a cloudburst. It was like solid water tumbled down. For a long time Madeline sat her horse, head bent to the pelting rain. When its force lessened, she heard Stuart calling for all to follow, and she looked up to see that he was starting on once more. She shot a glimpse at Dorothy and as quickly glanced away. Dorothy, who would not so much as wear a hat suitable for inclement weather, would not wear one of those horrid yellow sticky slickers, and she was drenched and disheveled, and she was quite the spectacle. Madeline did not trust herself to look at the other girls. It was enough to hear their lament. So she turned her horse into Stuart's trail. Rain fell steadily. The fury of the storm, however, had passed, and the roll of thunder diminished in volume. The air had wonderfully cleared and was growing cool. Madeline began to feel uncomfortably cold and wet. Stuart was climbing faster than formerly, and she noted that Monty kept at her heels, pressing her on. Time had been lost, and the campsite was a long way off. The staghounds began to lag and get footsore. The sharp rocks of the trail were cruel to their feet. And then, as Madeline began to tire, she noticed less and less about her. The ascent grew rougher and steeper, slow toil for her panting horses. The thinning rain grew colder, and sometimes a strong whip of wind lashed so that stung at Madeline's face. Her horse climbed, and brush and sharp corners of stone everlastingly pulled and tore at her wet garments. A grey gloom settled down upon her. Night was approaching. Majesty heaved upward with a snort, and the wet saddle creaked, and an even motion told Madeline she was on level ground. She looked up to see looming crags and spires like huge pipe organs, dark at the base and growing light upwards. The rain had ceased, but the branches of the fir trees and the junipers were water-soaked arms that reached out for her. And through an opening between crags, Madeline caught a momentary glimpse of the west. Red sun shafts shone through the murky, broken clouds. The sun had set. Stuart's horse was in a jog trot now, and Madeline left the trail more to Majesty than her own choosing. The shadows deepened, and the crags grew loomy and spiral. A slow, cool wind moaned through the dark trees. Coyotes, scenting the hounds, kept a pace of them, and barked and howled off in the gloom, but the tired hounds did not appear to notice. As black night began to envelope her surroundings, Madeline marked the fir trees had given place to pine forest. Suddenly, a pinpoint of light pierced the ebony blackness. Like a solitary star in the dark sky, it twinkled and blinked. She lost sight of it, and then found it again. It grew larger. Black tree trunks crossed her line of vision. The light was a fire. She heard a cowboy song and the wild courses of the pack of coyotes. Drops of rain on the branches of trees glittered in the rays of the fire. Stuart's tall figure, with sombreros slouched down, was now and then outlined against a growing circle of light. And by the aid of that light, she saw him turn every moment or so to look back, probably to assure himself that she was close behind. With the prospect of fire and warmth and food and rest, Madeline's enthusiasm revived. What a climb! There was promise in this wild ride and lonely trail and hidden craggy height, not only in the adventure her friends yearned for, but in some nameless joy and spirit for herself. End of chapter 15.